And we, in fact, are live. Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. It is Orange and Blue today. It is Cecil Lammey. It is Andrew Mason. And it is Denver Broncos talk with you. And Mace, I hope you had a good weekend. And I don't mean to start with this topic and sound like the grumpy old get off my lawn guy, but I can't stand April Fool's Day. I just don't see the point of it. The Steelers are tweeting about signing. Hey, we signed Calvin Broadus, everybody. Snoop Dogg's going to play wide receiver. I'm like, oh, God, please. Are we done? Are we done with April Fool's Day, please?
It's only one day a year. I think, you can take it. You can take it a little more lightly. So I guess you're saying that you didn't like my faux uniform mock-up for the Broncos where they had the word mark was done in Comic Sans and the D was in Comic Sans and they didn't have a white jersey and anything like that. The funny thing is people, there are some people I actually like that. And as I said to somebody when I responded later on that day, I created that. I did it 7 years ago and I just thought I'd bring it back just for the heck of it. I did it in part because I thought that uniform was so bad that no one would like it, that no one could possibly take it seriously. And some did. And of course, the Broncos did something similar with Miles doing a video, of a uniform proposal. So,
right.
Man.
Well, here we go. It's what you get. What you get on Orange and Blue today. It's brought to you by Champ Honda. Is some interesting takes about the Denver Broncos, and you wrote about it at denversports.com. I want everyone to go there right now, denversports.com, sign up for that Denver Sports Daily. But the interesting strategy that defined the Saints drafts with Sean Payton. I thought it was a fascinating examination of the New Orleans Saints, what they did with Sean Payton. Of course, Mickey Loomis, their GM, who you and I both have a healthy amount of respect for. But when you look back at the history of the New Orleans Saints with Sean Payton and all the great teams that they were able to put together, and that 2017 draft really stands out to me, of course, where you have Marshawn Lattimore and Ryan Ramczyk and Alvin Kamara and Trey Hendrickson. Never forget Trey, because that guy was a beast and a stud. We saw them both down at the Shrine down in Tampa. So I look at that, and your article really highlighted something that we need to emphasize to Broncos country, Mace. Sean Payton's never had a lot of picks. And he's built his team regularly into a playoff, if not Super Bowl contender, with, in your examination, the fewest picks of any team in the league.
I mean, it was something that I wanted to investigate because I'd been thinking about it for a while. I knew that the Saints would probably come in near the bottom. I did not know just to what degree, because over the 16 years of Sean Payton's time there, Cease, they had 15 fewer picks than team number 31. So basically, there's nearly a pick a year difference between the Saints and team 31. That's the San Diego, now Los Angeles Chargers. On average, in that span, teams had 7.96 picks per year. The Saints have 5.88 picks per year. And so it's fascinating that they have gone for quality over quantity. A big part of this does come from the fact that the Saints, usually very active in free agency, they don't get compensatory picks. They only got 4 comp picks during the entire Sean Payton era. The average team got 16 and a half comp picks in that span. The Saints don't even get 25% of that. And so that explains some of why the Saints are at the bottom. Although even if they had an average number of comp picks, they'd still have fewer draft picks than anybody else, which then leads you to the Saints' proclivity for trades, for like trades like when they moved up to get Marcus Davenport.
Right.
And they sacrificed a future number one to move up. I believe it was 13 slots to take Davenport. And it's a philosophy that they continued last year, which is why they were sitting there without a first round pick until they traded Sean Payton's rights to the Denver Broncos. So it's really interesting. It's not that and you mentioned the 2017 class. They've had other picks that have hit. They've done pretty well at finding some gems in the mid to late rounds. I mean, you think about guys like Teron Armstead, Zach Strief, who's now the Broncos' offensive line coach, Jimmy Graham. These are guys you get round 2 to round 6 that they find value. One thing I did mention in my article, Cease, is that it's sort of ironic that the Saints came in so low on comp picks because in Sean Payton's first draft with the Saints, they had a 7th-round comp pick who they used on Marcus Colston, who became the greatest receiver in the history of that team.
Yeah.
So the lesson from that was not, oh, let's make some moves to make sure that we're on the positive side of the comp pick calculus so we get more picks. It was, who cares about comp picks?
Yeah, who cares about comp picks? And we'll leave the light on for you since my shirt looks like a Motel 6 curtain, thanks to Brad in the chat room. Again, Orange and Blue Today brought to you by Champ Honda. And Mace, the thing you bring up about Colston, Hofster's very own, and 2006 Shrine Game, which was in San Antonio. It was actually the year before I started going in 2007. I have missed a year since. But, it's finding those late-round picks. But then we get to the conversation of it's like Sean Payton, who's okay with few picks, George Payton, who wants picks. I think the kind of, ignorant question for me would be like, who wins? We know Sean Payton wins. But how does George Payton adjust his strategy? Because he doesn't get multiple darts to throw at that draft board.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Payton's already said they're more likely to go down than trade up. Joe Horn, by the way, Jose, was pre-Sean Payton. And yes, with all respect to Joe Horn, Marcus Colston was better. Marcus Colston holds every major receiving record in Saints history in terms of catches, yards, touchdowns, etc. Sorry. Joe Horn, no. Marcus Colston, yes. But I digress. George Payton's already said it's more likely that they move down. And that they're more inclined to move down. Of course, the thing is, was he speaking for himself or was he speaking for the entire organization? And the other thing that comes into play, I did mention that even after Sean Payton, Mickey Loomis still went with that philosophy last year, which again was why the Saints were feeling the need to trade Sean Payton and get what they could this year because they needed to get that first-round pick back to get back in the first round. I thought that was kind of a reckless trade on their part a year ago. So now it is Sean Payton's show. But how much does he listen to George Payton's recommendations when it comes to draft philosophy? Because the thing with Sean Payton is he's going to do a fair amount of evaluation, but he can't be in the weeds on the draft in the way that George Payton is, right? And so how much of that becomes, all right, George, I need X, Y, and Z. Your job is to get those types of players from me, whatever path you use in order to do that. And so, does how we define Sean Payton change a little bit because maybe he does buy into the things that George Payton recommends? That's what we don't know right now. I will admit we are just kind of spitballing and guessing here because we don't know what those conversations are like. We don't know what the back and forth is like right now. As they mentioned last week, they're basically spending most of their days in a darkened room at Broncos headquarters with scouts popping in and talking about various players that they evaluate and all that, but they're doing a lot of study. How much of what the Broncos do this year becomes Sean Payton and how much becomes George Payton? And I think if you see the Broncos trade down a couple of times, I think you'll get your answer. If they say take one of those early third-round picks and move down a couple of times, kind of like they did in 2021 when they turned when they turned a third-round pick into 2 third-round picks and got Quinn Miners and Baron Browning. If they make deals like that, I think you'll be able to say clearly Sean Payton had George Payton influencing him a lot and that he trusted him on this. If we see an inclination to move up to take those 2 third-rounders and package them into the middle of the second round, then I think it's a Sean Payton draft.
Well, and I like the fact that George Payton, again, has responded so well to pressure. Because, Mace, I think I've made you fall out of your chair when I said, hey, I got to praise George Payton for his job this offseason. But, yeah, I mean, we're only going to tell you the truth on this show. George Payton's done an outstanding job on paper getting the Broncos talent. But I like this responding to pressure because, again, late in the draft, Sean Payton is not going to be in the weeds like George Payton. So, hey, George, we're going to rely on you. now come through. And if he doesn't, then he knows it's his job. Maybe not this year, whatever. I don't want to be overly dramatic, but that's the pressure of the NFL. Results or you're gone. And the Saints have been very, not necessarily dangerous, but like the Saints have been just cavalier with their picks. The Davenport move at the time, Mace, you and I saw Davenport. I think it was Senior Bowl. Where did we see Davenport? Because he was UTSA kid, right?
He was one of the stars of that year.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
I liked him.
But to move up like that,
I didn't like
pass
what they
rusher?
sacrificed for him. That was the thing.
Exactly.
Now, that was 2018, and they were very much in an urgent window at that moment. They had gone to the divisional round the previous year. The previous year was when they lost the game in Minnesota, the Minneapolis Miracle, right?
Yes.
So there was an urgency there, but one thing that kind of defines the Saints' moves over the years is the general thought pattern that, all right, this is the move that's going to push us over the top. They haven't gone Rams, F them picks. They haven't gone to that degree, but certainly they have been governed by more of that short-term need to get, hey, we love this guy. We have to get him right freaking now. Right. And the thing is, there are other teams that tend to take advantage of that. And, Green Bay, have they won a Super Bowl? No. Have they been more successful in the last few years than the Saints? Yes. Mm-hmm. Green Bay capitalized on that. The fact that the Saints were very much in kind of they were in, I hate to say prisoner of the moment mode, but they were in, let's get that player right now. And and because of that, the way the draft calculus goes, the next year's draft capital, a lot of teams consider it to be worth less than this year's, just because you know what you're dealing with right now. You don't know what you're dealing with a year from now. But teams that play the long game and capitalize off of teams like the Saints and their willingness to make some audacious moves, you end up with more draft capital on the back end just by trading down, being patient. And so I do worry that the Broncos, if they go down that path, might find themselves on the wrong end of some deals. I credit the Saints in terms of their player identification when they pick, because as I note in my story, with fewer picks, I believe 34 fewer picks than the Broncos over the 16-year Sean Payton era. With 34 fewer draft choices, they had more Pro Bowlers and more All-Pros in terms of what they did in that team's uniform than the Broncos did. So fewer picks, more players reaching a high ceiling, and then you take a look at the overall record. Clearly, the Saints have done a good job maximizing what they have, but as we've seen, it's sometimes led to them being caught short. And so you have a year like 2019 where they don't have a first-round pick. You have a year like this year where if Sean Payton had not wanted to get back in, the Saints be sitting there without a first-round pick, because the move they made last year, which was very much we think we can go for it right now. And I think you and I both had the same thoughts when the Saints were sacrificing this year's draft capital to move up and to move up in the first round last year. Like, whoa, what are you doing? You guys aren't that close. It's not the type of deal that you should be making. And you have Dennis Allen
as your coach.
Yeah.
So trouble afoot at the Circle K.
Trouble in River City.
That's right. It is Orange and Blue today. Cecil, Lammey, Andrew Mason, of course, OBT, brought to you by Champ Honda. Moving on, Tim Patrick has been cleared. He was on, he told former wide receiver Steve Smith on the Cut to It podcast. Everyone has a podcast right now, but I love Steve Smith, that he has been cleared to do everything after recovering from a torn ACL. Patrick said he's working to rebuild his route running mechanics because of the pressure certain routes put on his healing knee. So Patrick to Steve Smith, Cut to It podcast. He's cleared to do everything. Okay. Again, we're kind of peeking through keyholes with Sean Payton. How much of everything will he be doing in the spring leading up to the summer?
Well, we're still sitting here. I believe it's 7 weeks out from when the Broncos actually practice for the first time. They're going to be able to gather for workouts next week. They could have had some practices at the end of this month if they'd had the voluntary veteran minicamp. They're not going to have that. So we're looking at their first practices being. I mean, today is what, the third.
Third,
so
yeah.
we got another 27. Yeah, so we're basically we're looking at over a month and a half before the Broncos are actually out there practicing again. And so being clear for everything, that's great. That means that you can kind of start building him up. And when you get to OTAs, when you actually go offense versus defense, you are going to be a little more than 9 months removed. Actually, I think it's actually more like 9.5 months removed from when he tore the ACL. And it was a clean tear. It wasn't the Javonte Williams injury with multiple ligaments. It was a clean ACL tear. And that is a reasonable time frame. You have him doing individual work, working on the route running, strengthening that knee over the next several weeks. He ought to be able to do a decent amount of work when you're out there for OTAs, and I think you'll ease him back in. But I think if you're Sean Payton and you look at where he's come, how far he's come so far, and you look at the timeout from the injury and the nature of the injury, I think you can have him out there doing some team period reps when you get out there for OTAs at the end of May. I think it's a great sign, and I don't think you're rushing him back either by doing this.
No.
And that means you get him past that hurdle. And then when training camp begins, full tilt.
Full tilt, Tim Patrick. That's good news for the Denver Broncos, Mace. The one thing that they're going to have to do probably is pump the brakes on the guy. Because we know that I'm thinking of Little Giants for Steve Ettman quote, where he's like, football's 90% physical and 90% mental, or whatever that math was. But I feel like with Tim Patrick, other players, and I'm not talking about Cortland Sutton, but we've seen other players have the mental part of that knee, like thinking of the weakness, thinking, I felt a little something. Tim Patrick is fearless. Okay, Tim Patrick is the guy where he's going to go full blast as soon as he possibly can. He's going to listen to his, medical advisors, what have you. But if you're the Broncos, you're not going to have any worries about Tim Patrick starting and going full out when he can and when he's allowed to.
Yeah, I don't think there'll be any concern. The concern is just making sure that he doesn't push too hard. But that's where you just be judicious with him. But the thing is, the time frame since the injury, and that's what is the key thing here. He didn't have the injury at midseason, didn't have the injury in late season. He had it in August. And Nate Albert says they need to learn from the Sutton injury and not rush him back. I don't think they rushed Cortland Sutton back, to be honest with you. It's KJ Hamler who got rushed back. Cortland Sutton had his injury in September of 2020, and then you're looking at him out there getting some training camp run in 2021. I thought they were actually pretty prudent with Cortland Sutton. It's just that for whatever reason, and I don't think it's because they messed up in the rehab, he has not been the same player since then. But I do get the concern because the thing that always comes up, understandably so, in Broncos country, when you're talking about Tim Patrick being back, is the worry that does he get all the way back? Because Cortland Sutton clearly has not gone all the way back. I mean, he only has 4 touchdowns in the last 2 years. So,
right.
And yeah, I know he's had substandard quarterbacking. There are plenty of receivers with substandard quarterbacking who have been productive since time immemorial. So I don't buy that as an excuse for Cortland Sutton. It's just that he has not been good enough over the last 2 years.
Well, and both of us with our eyes field level, and here comes an old Cecilism that you're gonna. I'm not quite up to Troy Rank levels, but I do have a few sayings. Like the times that we've seen Sutton look like old Cortland Sutton, you can count on one hand of a bad wood shop teacher. Okay, since that injury, how many times? Like seriously, just think of last year in training camp. I'm thinking of like 1 or 2 plays where he would like moss somebody, 1 or 2, and it was never Surtain. It was never Surtain. We should have been watching one of the greatest battles in the NFL on a daily basis in practice, Pat Surtain versus Cortland Sutton, and we just don't see it. I mean, Surtain blankets him. So Sutton has rarely looked like the old Sutton, and sometimes I always go to Vincent Brown. Nobody knows Vincent Brown except you, but like I always go to sometimes if a guy has just enough juice to make it, then when he gets hurt and that little bit, 5% less juice. Well, yeah, but he needed 101% of that juice to make it. Maybe Sutton's one of those guys. And I hate to say it because I love Court, but our eyes tell us something different.
I hope that's not Tim Patrick as well, because Tim Patrick's another guy who has maximized his gifts to get to where he is. And so that's going to be the concern until we actually see it for real. It's funny, you talk about the duels that we expected between Cortland Sutton and Pat Surtain. When we saw Pat Surtain challenged, it was Jerry Jeudy.
Yes.
It wasn't Cortland Sutton.
Yes.
Which is another reason why Jerry Jeudy is the best receiver on this team. And why he's got the highest ceiling. And why, I mean, even I would not trade him, but if you did get an audacious trade for him, I think you'd have to think about it because you would be trading high. The problem with trading Cortland Sutton now is you're trading low. You're trading low. You're gonna get pennies on the dollar from what your initial investment was. And really, again, if you play the long game, and I know this is something that Sean Payton and the Saints didn't always do, but if you play the long game, and to George Payton's credit, he played the long game with Bradley Chubb last year, and they end up trading him when his value was peaking rather than in the offseason when his value was at a low point. If you play the long game and roll the dice, maybe Cortland Sutton does get back to something closer to what he was, and then, yeah, I think you pull the trigger on a deal, but not today.
Okay, it is Orange and Blue today. Cecil, Lammey, and Andrew Mason, of course, OBT. Orange and Blue today, presented by Sean Honda. Before we get to Philip Lindsay being back in football, in the XFL. I always blow out my vocal cords every time I say that. We do have a little bit of, not necessarily breaking news, but it is some news. Denver Broncos cornerback Faion Hicks was arrested on 3 charges Saturday, April 1st, the most serious of which was a 3rd-degree felony for carrying a concealed firearm after he was pulled over in his vehicle for disobeying a stop sign in Florida. Hicks, who was also cited for having an expired driver's license of less than 4 months, is out of jail on bond. That is from #9sports. So there you go. And this seems like more of a July story, certainly. But if you're Faion Hicks, you got Sean Payton, running the show, new rules, new look, new Broncos, new you. You don't want any of this stuff, man. Like none of it whatsoever. You don't want any sort of trouble with the law, and however, whatever happens, innocent until proven guilty, all that kind of stuff. Like it's just, man, you're on the roster bubble, man. You can't afford to have something like this.
Yeah. When you're a fringe player, the last thing you want to be perceived as is a headache and causing headaches. And this is the sort of thing right here that causes headaches. And they've already brought in Tremon Smith to help provide depth. They brought back Isang Bassi. I mean, do you think that Sean Payton has given Faion Hicks a moment of thought until today? And that's the thing. Like, I doubt that Sean Payton has spent a lot of time really dissecting Faion Hicks's film. And he's probably thought much more about Pat Surtain and others who are higher up the depth chart and other positions of need and prominence. This, if you're Sean Payton, you're probably looking at this and thinking, WTF, right? Like, I haven't even met you, haven't even been around you, and all of a sudden, this is what I'm learning about you. This is, I mean, it's not good. Look, there are more players on the bubble than I think most realize. I think the bubble goes all the way up to some guys that people know, just because when you have a new coach and he wants to put his own stamp on an organization, there are going to be changes, and sometimes reasonably productive players are going to be on the outs. I mean, Jacob Bobenmoyer was a pretty good long snapper, and the Broncos didn't make an attempt to bring him back, and now he's a Las Vegas Raider reunited with Tom McMahon. By the way, I don't know if you saw the story from Victor Fur in The Athletic over the weekend, but some Raiders are questioning why they needed to bring in Bobenmoyer when they had a perfectly good long snapper already there. So,
Yeah, yeah.
but it's something that Josh McDaniels does, because McDaniels, when he came to Denver, brought in Lonnie Paxton. When you had a perfectly serviceable, and actually serviceable is probably the wrong word, Mike Leach was a very good long snapper, who then immediately went on to Arizona after he got spurned by the Broncos and played, I believe, 8 more seasons in Arizona. So,
Right.
But one of the things that we're seeing is that just because you're fine at your job doesn't mean that Sean Payton isn't going to try to replace it with somebody that he just thinks is a better fit, or at the very least can bring some new blood into the locker room. And
You
that's
mentioned it
what,
on
yeah,
this show
yeah.
last week, Mace. Like, you don't have to be markedly better. You could
Right.
be almost the same damn player, but you're Sean Payton's guy, or you're just going to be different because the losing ways of this franchise, and it goes beyond Faion Hicks. This is for a lot of players.
Yeah.
That roster bubble for the Broncos this year is far and wide.
I mean, Marquez Callaway, for example. I mean, I think you and I both like Brandon Johnson's potential. But if they're equal, do you think he's going to go with Johnson, or he's going to go with Callaway, who he knows and has seen work and has seen start? And it's sort of the opposite of what happens when you've got stability and when you have a coach who's returning. Usually, incumbency favors. Incumbency is what wins the day when you have a tie on all counts. I think what you're seeing this year is that it may be the exact opposite. Incumbency may end up working against some players on that roster bubble because of the team-wide failures of the last few years, and just the need to kind of bring in a transfusion of attitude and other things into the locker room.
Well, let's talk about attitude. That is a perfect segue, Andrew Mason, media professional, because that's what I think of when
I didn't
think
even
of
know
Phil
I was
Lindsay.
having a good segue. That's very kind.
Yeah, well, I mean, just set it up, knock it down, baby. But
Yeah.
Feed Phil is back. Philip Lindsay is back playing football, and that makes me feel good. Whether it's Seattle Sea Dragons or whatever, like, it shows the brutality of this game to have that much talent, to make that immediate impact for the Broncos, to be a back-to-back 1,000-yard rusher, and then, I mean, you're out of the league. You're out of the league. So it makes me feel good that Phil's playing football again. We wish him well. But, man, this is a brutal business, especially for running backs.
It is. I mean, I credit him for coming back and playing, still wanting to pursue it. He played briefly for Indianapolis last year. We actually saw firsthand his most extensive work when the Colts were in Denver back for that Thursday night, crap fest of a game in Week 5. But obviously, did Siri not like me saying it was a crap fest of a game? Well, I'm sorry, but it was. It was a terrible game. But I do like seeing players who that they still want to keep going. And the thing is, there are some guys who will not humble themselves to go be in the XFL or the USFL, which is starting its season here in a few weeks. I was thinking about Colby Wadman over the weekend. Remember him, Broncos punter for a couple of seasons,
Yeah.
2018, 2019. And he punted last spring for the Birmingham Stallions. And I believe he's going to be back again for the Stallions here in the 2023 campaign. I think it does require eating some humble pie in terms of being willing to go down there and pursue that path back. The funny thing is, we see it in other sports, like in baseball, for example. I was watching a part of the Braves Nationals game yesterday, and you had a picture come in. I believe it was Michael Tonkin came in, and this guy was out of major and minor league baseball entirely. He went over to Japan, I believe. He was pitching over in the Atlantic League, which is not affiliated with any Major League Baseball teams, to try and get a shot, and worked his way back, and there he was on the Major League roster of a team that fancies itself a World Series contender. Rockies fans, I'm sure, are familiar with the story of Tyler Matzek, who, kind of had a meltdown. They're familiar with the story of Daniel Bard, who, had the yips and then, and kind of, went underground almost for a couple of years before working his way back to the major leagues with the Rockies. So it's cool to see a player like Philip Lindsay doing that, and hopefully it works out for him. I do root for him to succeed. But here's another thing. If you have guys that go to the XFL and USFL and they work their way back into the NFL, that's terrific. And I think then you'd see more players take that route, knowing it could get them back. And I think that's also part of a thriving player development structure that we see in other sports that we don't have in football, is not only players that take a long time to develop, but also players who, for whatever reason, end up on the outside looking in and then work their way back to the big time.
Wishing Philip Lindsay all the luck and success in the world. I think of Cody Latimer. He's the leading touchdown getter, I believe, in the XFL. He's near the top three at least.
Terrific.
He's playing tight end now.
Yeah. I mean, think about that. Not only wanting to humble himself by going to the XFL, but changing positions down there and being terrific. I mean, you look at Cody Latimer, you see a guy who looks like he can still play.
Yeah.
And deserves another shot somewhere in the NFL. And without these types of leagues, these stories do not happen. And that's another reason why football needs some form of minor league development structure. It's not just for the young players, it's for the older guys that are trying to work their way back.
That is a wrap for today's program. It is Orange and Blue Today, brought to you by Champ Honda. Mace, everyone's fascinated by what I'm drinking. What are you drinking today, as I see your cup flash onto the screen?
Iced tea, although people aren't going to like this because it's a cup that I got at the Broncos-Chiefs game.
Okay. Uh-oh.
Yeah. Because I just get the cups wherever I go. I got a bunch of Broncos cups, but I just happened to grab the Chiefs one today, so I hope you all forgive me. I collect from around the NFL, so
yeah.
Sorry, folks.
That's what you do. All right. He's Andrew Mason. You follow him on Twitter at Mace Denver. I'm at Cecil Lammey. OBT is a BFD, and we appreciate each and every one of you for watching. So for Mace, I'm Cease. Until next time, be safe, be kind, know that you are appreciated. Stay tuned. And as always, please, I would like you to stay frosty.